All right, so I think with that, let's go ahead and make a start since we have so much to learn today. My name is Dr. Alexis Clark, and I am the Community Resource Coordinator for the Durham Eviction Diversion Program at Legal Aid of North Carolina. And I'd like to welcome all of you, but especially our local municipal and state political leaders, to this first lecture in a series that has been co-sponsored by the Duke Civil Justice Clinic. Before I introduce our speaker today, Richard Rothstein, I wish to share some details about what the Durham Eviction Diversion Program does and what it promises to do in 2021. From the start of the pandemic to the present, our program has provided free legal service to hundreds upon hundreds of low-resource families and residents faced with housing insecurity and eviction. While we represent tenants in court, as part of my work, I also seek to amplify the voices of our clients, empowering them to represent their own stories. As a client, Kimberly reported about our work together, and I want to quote Kimberly. Legal aid saved me from being evicted. They helped me with other issues in my personal life. They shared some resources I knew nothing about. They helped me get my license back. They helped me get electric bills waived. Had it not been for legal aid, I would be homeless. I would have been homeless. To keep clients like Kimberly in their homes, we are raising rental assistance funds, with all donations to be given back to our neighbors in Durham. Everyone has the right to live in a safe and secure home. Yet what has happened with the rise of housing insecurity and eviction in Durham and across the state and the country has deeper roots than the present pandemic, as we'll learn today. The daily barriers to housing security confronted by families and residents aren't singular, they're systemic. Too often, we're told to blame ourselves for our misfortune, but we're subject to a system of laws larger than ourselves. Only if we unite in the fight for housing security can we put an end to the everyday injustices that fall disparately on our most vulnerable community members, neighbors, friends, and family. I wish to now introduce our speaker, whose research directly addresses these issues. Richard Rothstein is the author of The Color of Law, a forgotten history of how our government segregated America. He is Distinguished Fellow of the Economic Policy Institute, the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and the Haas Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. In addition to The Color of Law, he is the author of many other articles and books on race and education, including Class in Schools, Using Social, Economic, and Educational Improvement to Close the Black-White Achievement Gap, and Grading Education, Getting Accountability Right. Richard, I want to thank you for your work, for your solidarity, and for what promises to be a stimulating talk. And so with that, I want to cede the Zoom room to you.
Well, thank you very much, Alexis, and thanks to all of you for engaging in this conversation with me this morning, or this afternoon, I guess it is by now, huh? Okay. Let me begin by saying that, as you all know, especially in Durham, there was a civil rights movement in this country in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. It began by challenging segregation in law schools, and then in colleges and universities, and then in 1954 succeeded in persuading the Supreme Court to prohibit legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And that Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954 gave inspiration to a movement of activists who engaged in marches and demonstrations and civil disobedience. Some people lost their lives, others were severely injured. But by the end of the 1960s, that civil rights movement had pretty much persuaded much of the country, not everybody, but much of the country, that racial segregation was wrong, that it was immoral, that it was harmful both to African Americans and to whites, that it was incompatible with our self-conception as a democratic society. With that understanding, we succeeded in abolishing segregation in public accommodations in public transportation, in employment in many cases. And then in the wake of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King in 1968, we succeeded in passing a Fair Housing Act that prohibited ongoing discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. And then the civil rights movement ended and left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. Everyone that I lived in had clearly defined areas that were either all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that were either all African American or mostly African American. How could it be? If we came to an understanding that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both African Americans and whites, incompatible with our self-conception as a democratic society, how could it be that we left untouched the biggest segregation of all? We remain an apartheid society when it comes to neighborhoods. Well, partly it's because ending segregation of neighborhoods is hard. If we abolish segregation in restaurants, the next day you sit from in anywhere in the restaurant you want and go to any restaurant that you want. But if we abolish segregation in neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. And so what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, Northerners, Southerners, African Americans, and whites, is we've adopted a national rationalization, an excuse we give ourselves for failing to confront our own responsibility as American citizens to redress residential segregation. And the excuse, the rationalization goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation that we abolished in the 20th century of schools and colleges and public accommodations and so forth, that was all done by government. If the federal government was doing it, it was a violation of the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. If state and local governments were doing it, it was a violation of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. And if we have a constitutional violation, as Americans, we have an obligation to end it, to redress it. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves, that's something entirely different. That wasn't done by government. It wasn't done by law, by ordinance, by public policy, by regulation. Residential segregation, we tell ourselves, just happened naturally, by accident. It happened because, bigoted white homeowners or landlords wouldn't sell or rent to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or maybe because businesses in the private economy, not government agencies, but banks, developers, real estate agencies, private institutions, discriminated in how they carried out their private sector activities. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's just because people like to live with each other of the same race. We feel more comfortable that way. That's why we're segregated. Or maybe we say it's all economics, income differences. African Americans, on average, have lower incomes than whites. And so many African Americans can't afford to move to more middle-class communities. All of these individual, bigoted, private sector decisions, self-segregation, economic differences. This is what's created residential segregation. And we tell ourselves what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. We give a name to this myth, this rationalization. We say what we have is de facto segregation, just something that happened in fact, not in law. Well, as Alexis told you in the introduction, I spent much of my time before writing this book, The Color of Law, studying education policy. And in the 1990s and 2000s, I was writing many articles criticizing the dominant education policy of the country at the time. It was a widely shared policy supported by both Democrats and Republicans. We were concerned about the achievement gap in schools, the fact that African American children have lower average achievement than white children. And we argued that the reason that there's this achievement gap is because teachers have low expectations of Black children. They just don't try very hard. They're bigoted. They have contempt for the abilities of Black children. And if only we could make teachers try harder, if only we could hold them accountable for their students' achievement, the achievement gap would disappear. And we passed a law, the 2001 No Child Left Behind Act, broadly supported Republicans and Democrats both, that required children to be tested every year and schools held accountable for those test scores. And the law predicted that if this happened, if we simply tested children and shone a light on the poor performance of African American children, the achievement gap would disappear in just 7 years. I thought this was a ludicrous theory. Of course, some teachers have low expectations of Black children. This is a serious problem. It needs to be addressed. But that's not the most significant reason why we have an achievement gap. That explains a very, very small part of it. The reason we have an achievement gap between Black and white children is because so many Black children come to school with serious social and economic disadvantages that inhibit their ability to take advantage of even what the best schools have to offer. And I remember writing one column, I'll just give one example, one column about asthma. As you may know, African American children in urban areas have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle class children in suburban communities. It's an enormous difference, 4 times the rate. They have asthma because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more polluting industries nearby, more trucks driving through their neighborhoods, more dilapidated buildings, more vermin in the environment. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child who doesn't, it's not true in every case, but more likely to be up at night wheezing and then come to school drowsy the next day. And if you have 2 groups of children who are identical in every respect, same racial composition, same social and economic background, same family structure, but one group has a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group is going to have lower average achievement simply because it's drowsier in school by a tiny amount. It doesn't explain much of the achievement gap. But then when you begin to think about all of the other social and economic challenges that African American children disproportionately face, asthma, lead poisoning has a measurable impact on IQ, homelessness, economic insecurity. You begin to add all of these up, it pretty much explains the achievement gap. Teacher low expectations have a small part to explain. Well, I began to realize as I was thinking about this as an education policy writer, there's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity. But what happens if you have a school where every child has one or more of these challenges? How can such a school ever be expected to achieve at the same level as a school where children come well rested, well nourished, in economically secure homes? You can't have that expectation no matter how many laws you write requiring it. The No Child Left Behind law that we passed turned out to be an utter failure. 20 years on, we still have an achievement gap that's much like it was in 2000. The only thing the No Child Left Behind law accomplished is it gave schools an incentive to drop a well-rounded curriculum for African American and Hispanic children and devote excessive attention to trying to drill them in math and reading in a fruitless attempt to raise their test scores. Well, it's one thing, as I say, if a child has one of these conditions. It's another thing entirely if a school is filled with children with these, and we call schools that are filled with children with these social and economic challenges, we call them segregated schools. And schools are more segregated today than they have been, excuse me, at any time in the last 45 years in this country. And the reason they're more segregated is because so many more of them are in neighborhoods that are segregated. And so I began to think as an education policy writer that neighborhood segregation was an educational problem. That's how I came to this topic. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision that involved 2 school districts, one in Seattle, Washington, another in Louisville, Kentucky. Both of them had enacted a trivial school desegregation plan. They both gave parents the choice of which school in the district their child would attend. But if the choice was going to exacerbate racial segregation, that choice wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice of a child who would not do so. So if you had an all-white or mostly white school and both a Black and a white child applied for the last remaining place in that school, the Black child would be given some preference because that child would helped to desegregate the school in a trivial amount. You don't have a situation very often where you have one place left in the school and both a black and a white child apply for it. But the Supreme Court denounced this program, said you couldn't do such a thing, said it was a violation of the Constitution. The controlling opinion was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. He said it's true. The schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. He said they're segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. It was a wise observation on the Chief Justice's part. And then he explained that the neighborhoods in those cities were segregated de facto, in fact, not in law, because of private bigotry and actions of private businesses and people's self-choice and economic differences. And he said, where you have de facto segregation, something that wasn't created by government. Government is prohibited from taking explicit steps to redress it. Well, I read this decision and I remembered reading about something some years before happened in Louisville, Kentucky. A white homeowner in a single family home in an all-white suburb called Shively had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville. That African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran. He had a wife and a child. He wanted to move to a single family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in this all-white suburb of Shively bought a second home and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry mob of white neighbors surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. They dynamited and firebombed the home. The police made no effort to stop this activity. But when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year jail sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, the criminal justice system, the prosecutors, the courts were all engaged in a conspiracy to maintain racial boundaries in Louisville, I began to look into it further. And I found that Louisville was not an exception. This was not something that was peculiar to border states like Kentucky. There were, and I'm not exaggerating here, hundreds and hundreds of cases nationwide. In New York, in Chicago, in Denver, in Kansas City, in Los Angeles, and San Francisco, as well as in places like Louisville, of police protected, frequently police organized and led mob violence designed to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods. Every one of these cases was a constitutional violation, a 14th Amendment violation that we as Americans have an obligation to remedy, an obligation that we have never undertaken to accept. I began then to look into it further, and I found that there were many other federal, state, and local policies beyond state-sponsored violence that were explicitly designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area of this country. These policies were racially explicit, nothing de facto about them, and they determine the racial landscape that we have in this country today, as well as the racial inequality that we have in this country today. So in the brief time I have with you today, I'm going to describe a couple of the most powerful federal policies that were followed, but there were many others that I describe in my book, The Color of Law, at the local and state levels as well, designed to ensure that we be a segregated and apartheid society. Perhaps the most powerful one is a policy followed by the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administrations in the post-World War II period, when there were millions of returning war veterans coming home, needing housing, forming families. No housing was available to them. Very little had been built in the Depression or during World War II. And so there's a big housing backlog. The federal government designed to move all of the white working class and middle class families living in urban areas at the time, including these returning war veterans, into all white single family home suburbs that ringed every city of the country. Let me say that we would be surprised if we were transported back to that period of American history, because there were many non-segregated neighborhoods in urban areas at that time, much more than today. We'd be stunned if we were transported back that way. We had non-segregated neighborhoods in particular because we were a manufacturing economy, and factories needed to be located near deep water ports and railroad terminals to get their parts and ship their final products. And so if you had a factory district that employed both black and white workers, they all had to live in broadly the same neighborhoods. I'm not suggesting that every other house was occupied by a family of a different race, but broadly integrated neighborhoods so that they could walk to work or take short streetcar rides to their factories or banks or the service industries that service those factories. The federal government embarked on a program. It actually started before World War II, but intensified with World War II veterans, to move those white families out of these urban areas into single family homes in all white suburbs and prohibit African Americans from doing the same. These suburbs, we became a suburban country as a result of this policy. The suburbs are in every metropolitan area. They create a white noose around downtown urban neighborhoods. Perhaps the most famous of them is a big project east of New York City called Levittown. Perhaps you've heard of it, but they exist in every metropolitan area. Levittown, 17,000 homes in one place. No bank would be crazy enough to lend the developer, William Levitt, the funds to build 17,000 homes for which he yet had no buyers at a time when we weren't a suburban country, and the banks thought this was a crazy idea. The only way that Levitt and these other developers everywhere could get the capital to buy the land and build those homes by going to the Federal Housing and Veterans Administrations, submitting his plans, including the architectural design, the construction materials he was going to use, the layout of the streets, and an explicit commitment never to sell a home to an African American. The federal government, the Federal Housing and Veterans Administration, even required Levitt and many of these other builders to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was an explicit federal requirement. It was not the action of rogue bureaucrats working for the FHA and VA. This was an open and explicit requirement. The Federal Housing Administration issued something it called the Underwriting Manual, a written manual distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to recommend or not recommend the applications of developers for federal bank guarantees for their loans. The manual said explicitly you couldn't recommend for a federal bank guarantee the application of a developer who was going to sell to African Americans in a white neighborhood. The manual went so far as to say that you couldn't even recommend for a federal bank guarantee a developer of an all-white project if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living. Because in the words of the manual, and I'm quoting, that kind of project would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. In my book, The Color of Law, I have a photograph of a 6-foot-high, half-mile-long concrete wall that a developer outside Detroit had to construct at the behest of the Federal Housing Administration to separate his all-white project from a nearby African-American neighborhood as a condition of getting a federal bank guarantee for his loans to build his project. As I say, this notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. Well, those homes at the time, mid-1940s, late 1940s, sold inexpensively to working class families, white families, returning war veterans. They cost at the time about $8,000, $9,000 a piece. In today's inflation-adjusted money, that's about $100,000. Any working class family with a job in the post-war economy, white or black, could afford to buy a home for $100,000. It was twice national median income. And today, median income is about $65,000. So that would be the equivalent of about $130,000 home. Returning war veterans, black or white, would have been able to make such a purchase with no down payment, but blacks were prohibited from participating in this program. Well, those homes, as you know, no longer sell for $100,000. They now sell, depending on the region of the country, and $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, and some places $1 million or more. The white families who were subsidized by the Federal Housing and Veterans Administration to purchase these homes gained, surprisingly to them, wealth as their homes appreciated in value. Uh, those homes that sell now for much, much more than $100,000 gave them equity from rising property values. They used that wealth, that equity, to send their children to college, to perhaps finance temporary emergencies, medical emergencies, or maybe temporary unemployment. They used it to subsidize their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by explicit federal policy from participating in this wealth generating program. The result is that today, African American incomes, on average, are about 60% of white incomes. There's a story behind that. I don't have time to talk about that today. But you'd think that if there was a 60% income ratio, you'd have a 60% wealth ratio as well. Families can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But in reality, although African American family incomes are about 60% on average of white family incomes, African American wealth is only 5% of white household wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid 20th century, that we as Americans have an obligation under our Constitution, if we take our citizenship responsibilities seriously, to remedy. Well, that wealth gap, and this is only one of many, many policies that the federal and state and local governments follow, that wealth gap determines much of the racial inequality that we have today. I mentioned before the achievement gap in schools that results from concentrating the most disadvantaged children in neighborhoods without access to good jobs or healthy food or healthy air. That wealth gap determines in large part the achievement gap in schools, because their families have no wealth with which to make down payments in homes in neighborhoods of less concentrated poverty. The wealth gap determines health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans, as you know, have shorter life expectancies, greater rates of cardiovascular disease from living in those less healthy neighborhoods. The wealth gap also is a big part of the explanation of mass incarceration of young African American men, of the abuse by police of young African American men. I'm not suggesting for a minute that some police officers wouldn't abuse young African Americans if it were not for the concentration of those young men in segregated, disadvantaged neighborhoods. But the segregation that the wealth gap perpetuates intensifies significantly the police abuse. When you concentrate the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods without access to good jobs or the transportation to get to them, or the access to schools that aren't overwhelmed by the social and economic problems of their students, when you concentrate young men like that, it's inevitable that the police are going to not only engage in confrontations with them, but adopt tactics that are characteristic of occupying forces in disadvantaged and disaffected neighborhoods, habits of occupation that are characteristic of colonial countries in the 20th century, in India and the Congo, and in African American neighborhoods in this country. And the wealth gap also contributes to something else which is very, very frightening and dangerous. And that's the very wide political polarization that we have in this country today. It's not entirely racial, but it largely tracks racial lines, as we all know. How can you ever expect to develop the common national identity that we need to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that we have no ability to understand each other, to empathize with each other, to comprehend each other's life experiences? Under those circumstances of segregation, the construction of a common national identity is very difficult and is going to be very difficult. So this one policy that I've described, the FHA and VA policy of suburbanizing exclusively the white working class population, is itself responsible for a good part of the racial inequality and dangerous threats that our democracy faces today. And there were many, many other policies. I'll mention one more quite briefly. Public housing, something we all misunderstand. We think of public housing, most of us, I certainly did before I did this research, as a place where poor people live, uh, lots of single mothers with children, lots of those young men without jobs in the formal economy. That's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country uh, in the New Deal during the Depression, the Roosevelt administration. It was not for poor people. We had a 25% unemployment rate in the Depression. The unemployed weren't permitted into public housing. Public housing was for employed people with stable incomes who could afford to pay the full cost of the housing and their rent. There were no subsidies involved. Um, the federal government built the first housing for working class families with stable jobs. Uh, they um, uh, they did it because there was a housing shortage. The private sector wasn't building much housing in the Depression. And everywhere that the federal government built it, it segregated it, creating segregation in those neighborhoods that I described before that may not have been segregated before. The great African American poet, novelist, playwright Langston Hughes, whom I hope many of you are familiar with, described in his autobiography how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. He said in high school his best friend was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl in high school. It was an integrated high school, an integrated neighborhood, not surprising. Um, the Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood, demolished housing, and created two separate projects, one for African Americans, one for whites, creating a pattern of segregation with those and other projects created in Cleveland, also segregated, that persists to this day. In my book, The Color of Law, I like where I can to describe self-satisfied smug places that think they're better than Durham. Um, one of them I mention is Cambridge, Massachusetts. I imagine you may have heard of it. The area between Harvard and MIT, the Central Square neighborhood, was an integrated neighborhood in the 1930s, about half black and half white for the reasons I described before. Public Works Administration and other federal agencies went into that neighborhood in the 1930s, demolished housing, and built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation that persists to this day. The West Coast was segregated by this policy. During World War II, hundreds of thousands of black and white workers flocked to the West Coast to take jobs in war industries, jobs that hadn't been in existence during the Depression. There were very few African Americans living on the West Coast prior to World War II. Those of you who know the history of the Great Migration know that African Americans left the former slaveholding states and during World War I to go to the Midwest and Rust Belt and northeastern cities, but not to the West Coast. The first great migration of African Americans to the West Coast came during World War II, and they overwhelmed the West Coast cities where these war plants were located, the shipyards and the airplane factories. Federal government had to build housing for them if it wanted the ships and the planes and the tanks and the jeeps to be produced, and it did. The government built segregated housing everywhere, separate projects for whites, separate projects for African Americans. In San Francisco, it built 5 projects for war workers, 4 for whites only, 1 for African Americans, placed in the neighborhood that then became the black neighborhood of San Francisco. Across the bay, in another one of those smug, self-satisfied places that I happen to live in now, Berkeley, California, the federal government built housing for shipyard workers working in the Kaiser shipyards. It built housing for the white workers near the residential areas of Berkeley and a adjoining suburb called Albany, along the shopping areas, and for the African American shipyard workers along the railroad tracks in the industrial area, creating segregation that exists to this day. Well, there are many, many other policies, as I say, that I don't have time to describe to you today. I go into many of them in The Color of Law, but the policies to redress segregation are well known. There's no mystery about them. Policy experts, think tanks, um, journalists like me spend a lot of time spewing out great ideas about what we can do to redress segregation. What's missing is not policy ideas. What's missing is a new civil rights movement that will make it uncomfortable to maintain the segregation that we have in this country, that will create the political environment where some of those great policy ideas can be implemented. I'm working with a group of national civil rights leaders. I see that Ted Shaw is in the audience in this event, and I'm delighted to see him there. He's part of this group. We call it the New Movement to Redress Racial Segregation. Our goal is to create local committees, not policy advocacy, but local committees of citizens who will take action to make it uncomfortable to maintain segregation. I'll give you some examples of policies that we should be implementing. Some of them are quite unrealistic politically, but quite justifiable constitutionally. I mentioned those suburbs that we described before, all white, created in the mid 20th century, from which African Americans were excluded, selling at the time for $100,000 and now worth much, much more. The federal government should, as a very narrowly targeted remedy for a very specific constitutional violation, be buying up homes in those suburbs at market rates and selling them at deeply discounted prices to African Americans to help to desegregate those suburbs. The federal government also has programs at the low income end of the scale that reinforces segregation today. Those should be remedied. We have a program called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit that places a disproportionate number of low-income units in existing low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. I'm certainly not suggesting we shouldn't be building better housing in those neighborhoods. One of the goals of any new civil rights movement must be to improve the resources in low-income African-American neighborhoods. But we shouldn't be placing none or few of them in higher opportunity communities where families who choose to move there can have access to better jobs and clean air, grocery stores that sell fresh food, and schools that aren't overwhelmed by the social and economic problems of their students. The Section 8 voucher program is another one that reinforces segregation. The Section 8 vouchers, as you know, are calculated on the basis of the median rent in a metropolitan area. The median rent, of course, too low to rent an apartment or a home in a high opportunity neighborhood, and too high to rent in a low income segregated neighborhood. Landlords in those neighborhoods exploit the program by charging more than the market requires. There are a few experimental places in this country that are adjusting their voucher amounts so that they are worth more for a family who chooses to move to a more expensive neighborhood, and less for a family that chooses to move to a segregated neighborhood, because less is plenty to rent in those neighborhoods. We don't do it not nationwide, not because we don't know to do it. We don't do it because there's no political support for it. And in fact, many higher opportunity communities maintain zoning ordinances that make it practically impossible to find housing in those neighborhoods unless it's a single family home on large lot sizes, and those zoning ordinances should be challenged. So the policies are well known. Following this event today, I'm going to make available to you a link where you can get more information about the new movement to redress racial segregation if you choose. I'm also going to send you some articles that describe in more detail some of the policies we should follow. I'll give you one that is just especially egregious. Everywhere in this country, in every metropolitan area of this country, African American homeowners are paying higher taxes, higher property taxes for on their homes than whites are paying for homes of similar value. African Americans across this country are paying a disproportionate share of the costs of schools and fire departments and libraries. This property tax discrimination, in effect, if not in intent, is depressing incomes of African Americans, leading to foreclosures. It's a policy that should be attacked in every metropolitan area. It's very difficult to attack it legally, but it's not difficult to attack it with a movement, a civil rights movement that we should enact. In one article I'm going to send you, I talk about Syracuse, New York, for example, that hadn't reassessed property citywide for 25 years. Not because for racial reasons, the city just figured it was less expensive not to do a regular reassessment. Well, in that 25-year intervening period, properties in white neighborhoods appreciated in value at much greater rate than properties in black neighborhoods. The result was that the assessments in black neighborhoods had a much closer relationship to the market values of homes in those neighborhoods than the assessments in white neighborhoods had to the assessments in those neighborhoods. And as a result, African Americans were paying a much higher share of their property value in taxes than whites were. This is an extreme example, but this kind of thing exists all over the country, and it's something that, as I say, I'll send you an article about it, and should be attacked by a local civil rights movement. Well, with that, I'm going to stop and leave some time for questions. I'd be glad to engage in the discussion with you about this, and I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for helping us to knit all of those threads together. Looking at the chat and the Q&A, I know that there's really great appreciation for your work. And so we have a lot of comments, and I hope that we can get to many of them today. The first comment or question then we have comes from David, and he writes, over the past 20 years or so, Forsyth County, North Carolina's Community and Economic Development Office has helped more than 800 mostly Black families move from renting to home ownership by subsidizing down payments or qualified home buyers, mainly first-time home buyers. The average assistance was $2,000 per recipient. Fewer than 8% of homes were foreclosed upon, and recipients accumulated more than $34,000 in net equity in less than a decade. Would you speak to this type of model and or others that have proven to be effective in helping to reverse housing segregation efforts from the past?
Absolutely. This is one of the programs that a new civil rights movement should be advocating. And let me say that this funding for down payment assistance shouldn't just be coming from government. It should be coming from some of the private institutions that are responsible for the segregation and disinvestment in African American communities that we have today. I'm going to send you another article in which I describe a community in California, but you could do this for any community in the country, that was created in the 1940s for whites only, from which African Americans who could easily have afforded to move into that community at the time were excluded. And that's now unaffordable to working class, middle class community families of either race, except for whites who have down payment assistance from their families. Well, in this article that I'm going to send you, I identify the bank, the real estate agency, the developer that created that segregation at the federal government's behest as a white-only community. And that bank, that real estate agency, and that developer still exist in that community today. And a new civil rights movement should be conducting a campaign, a carefully calibrated and thought out campaign to get that bank, that real estate agency, that developer to contribute to a down payment assistance program that would enable African Americans not only to move into that community, but to move into better neighborhoods, better homes rather, in neighborhoods that they choose to live in where they may already live. So it's not simply a public program that's needed, it's a public and private program. And that will only come as a result of a mobilized citizenry that a new civil rights movement can organize. But I think it's a very important program. If I may, I don't want to take a lot of time because I know we have a lot of questions, but let me just say one thing. There is, however, a myth in this country that the only way and the best way to build Black wealth is through home ownership. Home ownership is one way to build wealth, but the only way you build wealth through home ownership, or the main way you build wealth through home ownership, is you happen to buy a home in a neighborhood that's going to appreciate in value faster than other neighborhoods. And historically, African American homeowners have not built wealth the way whites have because African American neighborhoods haven't appreciated in value. So we shouldn't only be focusing on home ownership. It's an important part of the solution. It's not the only one. As a way to build African American wealth, we need to be focusing on income policies as well. If, for example, we had a national health insurance program, families wouldn't have to dip into their savings for medical emergencies and would have the savings that could build wealth. That's just one example. So all of these things are interconnected, both housing policies and policies of economic justice. And we need to be conscious of all of them.
And so I want to continue on a bit with that thread, maybe about sort of thinking about the private as well as the public and what sort of private entities can do to foster equity, because we have several, I think, really excellent questions to that effect. And so James has asked, how can banks work within current regulations to not only address but reverse the effects of underwriting some of the decisions that you've described in The Color of Law?
Well, I've already mentioned that I think banks should establish funds. You might call them voluntary reparations funds, to subsidize African Americans and to try to compensate for the wealth and income that those banks robbed from them in the mid 20th century. But they're also like the property tax assessments that I described before. There are many policies that we follow, that banks follow, and other institutions as well, that are superficially race neutral, but that have what you lawyers call a disparate impact on African Americans. And one that banks follow, for example, is the way in which they do credit scoring for issuing mortgages. If you are a family who is buying another home, moving out of the one you own and buying another one, and you've paid your mortgage on your previous home on time, you get a credit in your credit score. You get a boost in your credit score for having been a timely payer of your mortgage payments. If you're a first-time home buyer who has been renting prior to applying for a mortgage for your home, you get no credit for having paid your rent on time. Now, this is not a racially explicit program, but clearly a disproportionate share of first-time home buyers are African American, and a disproportionate share of second or third or fourth time home buyers are white. So it's a policy that has an effective discriminatory effect, but that's not racially intentional. And I think banks should be pressed to change this, the way in which they evaluate the credit worthiness of applicants for mortgages. That's just one example.
So I think with that, that's a really nice segue into discussion of real estate and real estate companies and their sort of role in all of this. And I know that we have some people present in the audience who are coming from that profession. And so we have a question. Currently, if a buyer closing credit program was developed solely for Black homeowners, irrespective of income level, this would be a violation of fair housing. I've heard there are existing efforts in trying to change those rules to accommodate for what could be a small step in correcting the historic inequity. Do you know anything about that?
Well, no, I don't think it's a violation of fair housing. I think it's considered a violation of fair housing because we don't understand the constitutional context in which housing discrimination was created. As I said, racially targeted programs are in many cases a narrowly targeted remedy for very specific constitutional violations. And so I think that we should have racially targeted programs and let the opponents of them challenge them. I think if they do, civil rights lawyers will have a lot of good work to do defending such programs, and they are, I think, entirely constitutionally justified. We did, after all, have affirmative action in 40, 50 years ago in this country when we were more aware of the constitutional requirement to do so. We had affirmative action in employment, for example, in the construction trades, where trades were required to give preference to African Americans on the basis of the fact of their historic exclusion. We had universities that were permitted to implement affirmative action and admission programs because we understood that African Americans as a class had been disadvantaged from eligibility in universities in the past. And that was thought of as being perfectly appropriate at that time. And if we came back to that constitutional understanding, which I hope we will, the kind of racially explicit programs in the housing area should also be accepted.
All right. So I want to turn the discussion a bit more towards public housing and public housing issues in the local area, so the triangle, because our public housing has very much been in the news for the past year or so. The one question is, most Durham public housing was built in the 1950s and 1960s in primarily minority areas of the city. Now, under HUD's GRAD program, the Housing Authority is encouraged to rebuild or rehabilitate these developments using private investment because of decades of unfunded maintenance needs. These areas of the city are still predominantly minority. Will pursuing RAD be a perpetuation of segregation?
Well, let me say, I think that the redress of segregation has four distinct aspects. One is to improve investment and improve the quality of resources in existing low-income African-American neighborhoods in particular, and increasingly in Hispanic neighborhoods. I think that's something that's very important. It has to be a high priority. All neighborhoods should have higher quality. I don't think there's anything wrong with doing. In fact, it's a high priority to do that, provided that's not the only thing we should do. We should do three other things as well. We should enact policies that prevent the massive displacement of existing residents from gentrifying neighborhoods. And we know, again, what the policies to do that are. It's rent control, it's limits on condominium conversions, it's inclusionary policies that require a share of new development to be set aside for lower income and moderate income families. And we should be freezing property taxes for existing homeowners so that existing homeowners are not forced to leave homes that they may have fully paid off in order to, because they can no longer pay the property taxes on their homes. And we need to increase the opportunities for families who choose to do so to move to non-segregated neighborhoods with I described before, mobility programs for Section 8 vouchers by making it possible for people who have Section 8 vouchers to move to higher opportunity neighborhoods that might not be areas of concentrated African-American and low-income families. And finally, we need to enact policies that stabilize the desegregation of neighborhoods that have become desegregated but are threatened with resegregation because of white flight. And again, I don't have time to go into them. We know what the policies are to do in all of these areas. What's needed is not policy ideas. What's needed is a political will to implement them.
Yeah, so I think that very nicely leads into the last question that I'll ask, because your book, I think, does so much work to address institutions and how institutions and the government lead to these types of disparities and discrimination. And so some of our attendees have asked what they can do as individuals to try to strike more fairness and more balance in their own neighborhoods.
Well, I'm going to repeat then what I said something before. I'm not talking to you as policy experts or lawyers even. I'm talking to you as citizens. And I think, this new movement to redress racial segregation is going to try to help you organize civil rights groups in your communities. In some places they already exist and we'll support those. In other places we will help you create them. I am going to send you a way to get information about this new movement. And when we launch it, which should be in a few months, in any place where there is a concentration of citizens who want to participate in this kind of biracial, multi-ethnic movement, we're going to have organizers who are going to help you do that. So that's, I think, I can't do it, in a webinar, but I'm hoping that all of you will take seriously all our obligation to participate in the new civil rights movement. That's what we can do as individuals.
I want to thank you for that message, sincerely. I really appreciate your speaking to that sort of call to action about what we can do as people and the responsibilities we have as citizens. With that, I do want to introduce our board of directors for Legal Aid of North Carolina, Clayton Morgan, and he will provide the closing remarks. Thanks to you all for being in attendance today.
Thank you, Alexis. As chairman of the board of directors of Legal Aid of North Carolina, I do want to thank Richard Rothstein for spending time with us this afternoon and helping us understand his crucial and thorough research. For me, it was quite eye-opening and informative. Every day, our advocates encounter systemic injustice. At Lance, we believe that access to justice is a right and not just a privilege to those who can afford it. Today in our courts, in 3 out of 4 civil cases, one side is not represented by an attorney. When the most vulnerable are alone in court, they can be robbed of their dignity and trapped in cycles of poverty, violence, and poor health. At Legal Aid of North Carolina, we balance the scales of justice in civil court and push back against systems that can be exploitative and dehumanizing. Our advocates summon the strength every day to represent people in civil court who have those scales of racial, social, and economic justice woefully tilted against them. I'm immensely proud of our Durham eviction diversion program and our other eviction diversion efforts in Raleigh, Charlotte, and Greensboro. In every county across our state, Legal Aid of North Carolina has housing advocates who are helping families stay housed. I hope you will join us this Monday at 4 o'clock on Zoom or on Facebook Live for Q&A with our housing advocates. I invite you all to learn more about our different services and ask questions about obstacles to justice encountered in our state. Thank you so much for your support as we continue to increase access to justice, housing, healthcare, education, and economic stability for those who struggle to make ends meet every day. If you want to support our legal aid office, you can go to legalaidnc.org/donate. And thank you again, Richard, and thank you all for joining us today, as we are so grateful to have you as our partners in this most valuable work. Thanks again. Alexis.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.